Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. Lost Evan. In this video, we're going to do part 4, the final part of Little Blue Book number 1061, titled The Human Origin of Morals, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. And this is part 4. We will be doing the final 2 chapters, which are chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7, Moral Law is Social Law, and chapter 8, The Revolt Against Morality. Let's see, we begin on page 52. Okay. Back into the 50. There we go. There we go. Chapter 7. Moral law is social law. Let us clear our minds of cant. That is now an old and threadbare saying, but it ought to be put at the beginning of every essay and book on morality. I dare not suggest that it ought to be the text of every sermon, or the sermons would be too short. We talk and write the most solemn and often the most hypocritical nonsense about morals. This series of books is for people who want facts, sane thinking, and fearless utterance. We have now seen the facts. Let us draw and express plain conclusions. Moral law is social law. We have the whole story of its evolution before us. We have studied tribes without moral ideas, tribes with a dull glimmer of moral sentiment, and tribes with a moral code in every stage of development. We have put these tribes in the strict order of their degree of culture, as is, unfortunately, very rarely done. And this corresponds to the various chronological stages in the evolution of the race. We have seen how even the eccentricities and distortions of the moral sentiment can be shown to be part of a normal and continuous development. If this work were to run to 1,000 pages instead of less than 100, I could tell the whole wonderful story in fascinating detail. But we have seen enough here to convince any person, and other books develop the more important points. Moral law slowly dawns in the mind of the human race as a regulation of a man's relations with his fellows in the interest of social life. It is quite independent of religion, since it has entirely different roots in human psychology. It later, partly by natural development and partly owing to the increasing ambition of priests, blends with religion, but it is still overwhelmingly human and utilitarian. Justice, honor, truthfulness, honesty, fidelity, and hospitality are its main lines. It is only at a late stage that it begins to include virtues and vices, the utilitarian character of which can be disputed, and this development is plainly due in part to the primitive mind. Mysterious uncleanliness of a woman's sexual psychology, and to priestly calculations. Consecrated men and women find this an effective way of standing out from and above the common crowd. Virginity becomes the most shining of virtues. We now see plainly how superfluous is the work of moral philosophers. This, they will say, is a superficial sketch, and they are profound in its wholly untrue. What I have given the reader is a compilation of the most essential facts about the evolution of morals, never noticed by these theorists, and a series of the most rigorous and logical deductions from them. What they give their readers is an analysis of the conscience of a highly cultivated and refined modern man, in whose mind the influences of Christianity and a dozen other religions are confused with the plain moral law. It may be said that I explain the conscience of the savage, and they explain the conscience of civilized man. They will themselves say, I know the rhetoric well, that it is quite natural that the more obtuse and coarser mind of the savage should first perceive the less refined and more utilitarian aspects of moral law. But as the mind of man becomes more sensitive and receptive, it perceives the finer shades of this august reality, which has been slowly breaking through the mists. We now, we now, they say, recognize self-regarding virtues as well as roles of social value. And these, they insist, are completely inexplicable on the social or utilitarian theory of morals, yet are the most precise elements of character. Pause for hydration, Maddie. In this series of works, I am not concerned with philosophers as such. Not one of them is an Orthodox Christian, and very few of them believe in any kind of God whom the plain man can understand. But the mysticism of philosophy, in this respect, encourages those who believe in God to suppose that in conscience we really have a reality, a fact, which science cannot explain and which points to, as Eucken says, to a spiritual and supernatural order. So, let us work out the matter candidly. At the time when I was a professor of philosophy, moral as well as mental, and a priest, it was my duty to know every detail of this controversy about ethics, and the controversy was then at its height, on account of the recent rise and rapid spread of agnosticism. You can not, on agnostic principles, maintain the fine self regarding virtues. It was said to rationalists, since a self regarding virtue obviously means one that does not affect our fellows for good or evil. How could we urge how could we urge how could we urge it on social principles? In the first place, we could not enforce it. We should have little force even in urging it upon the mass of mankind. But we could maintain it without the least inconsistency. It is possible for any group of men and women to set up a standard of character which they think admirable and maintain it because they think it admirable. They may, as members of ethical, culture societies, do say that they will cultivate the good life for its own sake. They think a chaste and abstemious man or woman far superior to one who is not chaste or one who drinks beer and smokes. There is no reason in the world why they should not maintain and practice their ideal, and they are, in general, admirable, if somewhat narrow minded. Bodies of men and women of higher than the average Christian character. But, as I have pointed out to them for years, having lectured for them for 3 decades, there is not the slightest use in appealing to large bodies of people to cultivate the good life for its own sake. Only those who share their taste, their standard of character, will join. They make no progress. That proves the failure of rationalists to sustain character, says the moral philosopher. In point of fact, one of the leading British philosophers, Professor Bosanquet, who used to lecture in the ethical movement, quitted it a few years before his death, making precisely this statement. Religion was necessary, he said. What then did he offer the world instead as a basis of conduct? Hegelian absolutism, the most incomprehensible of all the metaphysical webs that were ever spun by the great spiders. Let us be practical. What are these self regarding virtues which cannot be sustained or enforced on social principles, and the command of which in the human conscience today disproves the social theory of morality? First, of course, chastity. In fact, one may as well say first and second and third and last chastity. The great struggle is about chastity or purity. I'm going to face that very candidly and fully, and I devote the next and last chapter to it. Let us be quite sure that it is the only point. As a rule, it is said that the three great vices are impurity, drinking, and gambling. Impurity, as I said, we take up in the next chapter. Gambling, on a small scale, is so little connected with morality that I have known parsons and bishops to indulge in it with a laugh. Practically everybody will admit that it becomes a vice only when it is liable to have consequences for others, for your wife and children. In fact, the girl who gambles in a club in New York or London or even Cincinnati or Kansas City often runs the risk of very serious consequences, as everybody knows. In other words, when gambling is a vice, it is because of its consequences. Oh, little itch. As for drunkenness, I have never been drunk except once, in Prohibitionist Chicago, when a man whose character I did not at the time know secretly drugged my innocent wine with alcohol. His innocent wine with alcohol. Terrible. Most of us have not the least temptation to get drunk. It means illness, incapacity for work, hours of misery for an hour's pleasure. That's true. In grave cases of habitual drunkenness, injury is done to dependents, and the social principle at once enters. In cases of occasional drunkenness, there is no need to invoke the moralist. The next morning will preach its own sermon. Yeah, it does. The idea that we shall all get drunk more frequently when we cease to believe in God is one of the funniest of propositions. In point of statistical fact, drunkenness during the last 100 years has decayed in almost the same proportion as religion. In respect of all three major vices, we shall prove that the world has grown steadily better, while ethical philosophers and preachers were proving to demonstration that it must be growing steadily worse. Well, what are the other self regarding virtues? Truthfulness? Theologians have always dealt with veracity as a utilitarian quality. The little lie, the white lie, was only a venial sin. The lie that injured others was proportionately grave. In fact, truthfulness is so obviously a desirable social quality that it is absurd to mention it in this controversy. Hydrate. What about on-scene acts? Either they have consequences to others and therefore fall under the social code, or consequences to the man himself, in which case he is a fool rather than immoral, or no consequences at all. The only serious case is that of sexual behavior, and we discuss it presently. But can we maintain a fine sense of honor, generosity, loyalty, and unselfishness? You have only to reflect on the human consequences. If we could not, the human advantages, if we could, to answer yourself, no system of morals or religion ever did maintain such a standard generally. The task still lies before the race. We are steadily getting nearer to it. Take the word utility, in its broadest but quite legitimate sense, and ask yourself whether it would be of any utility to the race to have all men, or even the minority, strictly honorable, chivalrous, loyal, generous, kindly, and good natured. The human value to each and to all of us would be incalculable. Finally, remember that there is such a thing as the monumentum of character. I mean that a fine character once formed, a splendid human asset, expresses itself in every act. The honorableness and generosity extend to things where, on strict calculation, the man might act otherwise. I have known thousands of such characters, Christian and agnostic. They are not tempted to betray a confidence as another man would be. They are not tempted to steal or cheat when nobody looks on. Rhetoric apart, we want a better society composed of such men and women, and the intrinsic human value of such an ideal, the happiness and comfort and welfare it would bring, make it an essential part of our code of social morals. Someday, right conduct will be automatic. That would be nice, wouldn't it? That's the end of chapter 7. Hydrate, Maddie. A reminder to my friend Maddie to hydrate. Chapter 8. The Revolt Against Morality. Evolution throws a wonderful light on all the struggles, eccentricities, torturous developments of the human conscience in the past. It is the only theory of morals that does. It is the okay. And evolution throws just as much light on the ethical and social struggle today. And it is the only theory that does. What a strange age ours is from the religious point of view. What a hopeless age from the philosopher's point of view. Yet it is a very good age, the best that ever was. No evolutionist is a pessimist. I may assume that even my fundamentalist readers have heard of one philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. No, Nietzsche. You heard of him first during the war. You may not know that he loathed bloodshed and brawling, and, like Hegel, heavily criticized the beer drinking and dueling of German students. But you were convinced that he was responsible for that shocking demoralization of Germany, for which you heard so much. Next, you heard of him from William Jennings Bryan and Dr. Riley and whatever preacher you sit under, wherever you may be. An appalling murderer with awful details which were never published, was committed by two abnormal boys in Chicago. To save them, Clarence Darrow put the blame on their reading of Nietzsche, not on Nietzsche. As you were assured that this great scientist, he was not a scientist at all, but a literary man, and German, really, he was of Polish blood, and Darwinian, though he knew next to nothing about Darwin, proved that evolution made an end of all morals. Probably you heard that a Briton named George Bernard Shaw said the same thing, but as he happens to be a fierce anti Darwinist, he may not have been mentioned. At all events, you will have heard that there was a terrible man in America named Wiggum, Wiggam, who gave the show away in the same manner. I could give you a dozen other names. I have an esteemed friend in England whom I avoid as much as possible. Throughout a long life, he has never played cards, never smoked, never tasted beer or wine, never entered a theater. How he comes to possess two children is a mystery to me. But he is one of the most ardent Nietzscheans in England. Strange, isn't it? He is one of the gentlest of men. To tell you the truth, so was Nietzsche. He loathed bloodshed, cruelty, meanness, injustice, hypocrisy, and lies. The sight of all this in the world drove him mad. But he was not mad when he wrote his great works. For the grown man who can understand them, they were a splendid tonic and inspiration. But he wrote, however, in paradoxes and fiery exaggerations, as high strung prophets do. And he did make very serious mistakes, as most men did in the infancy of science. Nietzsche, though not a scientist, heard about Darwin and misunderstood him. He supposed that Darwin really said what fundamentalist writers made him say, that all progress depends on a bloody struggle for life. So there must be no mercy or philanthropy. What Darwin said was that in animal evolution, in the remote past, the law or fact had been bloody struggle. Darwin never dealt with the laws of human progress, now and in the future. In fact, he expressly defended humanitarianism. You see the simple mistakes of Nietzsche and of others who do not understand science. He thought that modern society was running counter to the essential laws of life. He thought, this was another great mistake, that Christianity had brought into the world the moral principles which made us help the weak. He thought he thought all this would ruin the race. And so, in pure humanitarian zeal, he fought morals and he fought Christianity. It is not strictly true that he rejected all moral principle. He was one of the most moral of men. He rejected the current morality as a slave morality and wanted it changed to a higher morality. However you read, or however, you need not worry about Nietzsche. Very few follow him, or even will follow him in his errors. You need not worry about your Wiggums. They are not advanced, but 40 years out of date. You need not worry about G.B. Shaw. He is the only real Shavian, as far as his essential ideas are concerned, in England. But there is one respect in which these anti moral writers have the support of a very large number of the most brilliant authors, chiefly novelists and dramatists, of modern times, and it has to be seriously considered. They attack morality. Do not shudder. It does not promote understanding. I know many of these men well. They are men of higher character than you and I. Let us understand it. When you say morals, most people think of the generally accepted code as regards sex. That is why they attack morals. They do not admit these sex rules. In other words, instead of the whole educated and refined world being agreed upon, the contents of the moral law, as philosophers and theologians say, half Half the most influential writers and artists of modern times reject what these philosophers and theologians regard as its essential context, sex regulations, and as half or more of the educated and refined people of the modern world prefer these writers to all others, you have a plain indication that moral law in regard to sex is very widely and seriously disputed in some respects. It is a simple and natural situation. I have described how religion and morals have been blended for tens of thousands of years. We have also seen how, under the influence of religion, ideas got into the moral code, which were not original parts of it. Now, in the 20th century, the world is discarding religion. Oh, I wish we had. they would McCabe would be so disappointed in where we are right now. And it is therefore re examining its moral code. Are there any elements of it which are purely ecclesiastical in origin? If so, they do not concern us. Are we to follow blindly the code of the Middle Ages? God, no. But that's what we're doing. Nobody does, not even Catholics. We have altered line after line of the moral ideal. Pride is no longer the greatest sin. Aestheticism is no longer the greatest virtue. Priestly celibacy will probably be abandoned in the Roman Church. Nope, never did. Birth control was practiced generally by educated clergymen. Go figure. The serious question is whether chastity, as such, is another of these ancient errors. Before you throw up your arms, reflect. It never was observed by the bulk of the community. Rupert Hughes has lately shown that even in the Puritan days in America, vice was rampant. So do not begin to paint a frightful coming degeneration, or rather, do paint this coming degeneration. Work out the consequences. But do not begin by saying that women and children will not dare to venture out, etc. The police will see to that. The world gets safer for them every decade. Well, then, you see, when you try to work out the consequences, you come to this conclusion. Many things will be done in violation of Christian law, but those who are not Christians can hardly be expected to observe a purity Christian law. As to any possible social consequences, our principles cover all that. There will still be law. It is no use your squirming. Social consequences will be attended to by society. Any act which involves injustice or does an injury is and will remain immoral. It is as much a part of our law as yours, and we apparently get it better observed by pointing out that it is a human and social law. The man who brings trouble upon a woman is guilty of a crime. The husband or wife who stealthily breaks the marriage contract and expects the other spouse to keep it flagrantly violates the law of justice. Yes, I know. Many will do it. They always did. So the evolutionary or social or what is broadly called utilitarian theory of morals smiles at all these supposed difficulties. Some things will be no longer considered immoral. Happen repeatedly. An act that injures no one in any way will be regarded as a man's or woman's own business. Hypocrisy, secret violations of contract, lies, all the things that have accompanied the universal immorality of the past will slowly disappear. It will take time, a very long time. We have inherited a dreadful past. But we are gradually getting more frankness, courage, honorableness, and consideration for others. Out of that dark, abhorrent chaos, which we have surveyed, a new order is rising. The finer and happier order of Shelley's Prometheus. And then there's a little bit of Prometheus, I guess, here. None wrought his lips in truth and tangling lines, which smiled the lie his tongue disdained to speak. None, with firm sneer, trod out in his heart the sparks of love and hope till there remained those bitter ashes, a soul self-consumed. That is the end of Little Blue Book, number 1061, titled The Human Origin of Morals, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.